You are almost certainly not a surgeon. You are probably not a professional athlete, or a fighter pilot, or an elite chess grandmaster. You have, in all likelihood, never been paid a single pound for performing under pressure. And yet there is a reasonable chance that at some point in your life you sat down with a ball of yarn or wool or a lump of clay or a half-finished embroidery hoop and entered the exact same neurological state that surgeons, athletes, and grandmasters spend years training to access. The same brain chemistry, the same measurable shift in neural activity, the same cocktail of dopamine, norepinephrine, and anandamide firing in near identical patterns. You got there with a crochet hook. Nobody told you it was supposed to be that powerful, and that is the problem sitting at the center of this story. Because here is the contradiction. Csikszentmihalyi spent the better part of 5 decades documenting a mental state that his research subjects consistently described as the most satisfying experience of their lives. Not just pleasant, not just relaxing, but the best. The state where time dissolves, where self-consciousness drops away, where the work and the worker become the same thing. He called it flow, and his subjects called it being carried along like a river current, which is how the word stuck in the first place. What Csikszentmihalyi also found in that same body of research was that people who knew this state existed, who had experienced it firsthand, who reported being happiest inside it, would still go home at the end of the day and choose the television. Every single time. The Neuroscience in 2025 is not vague about what crafting does to a human brain, and society is still treating it like a pastime for retirement. Start with the problem itself, because it is not a small one. Your brain has a default setting. When you are not actively engaged in a goal-directed task, a network of regions called the default mode network switches on. And this is the network responsible for self-referential thought, for rumination, for replaying that conversation from 3 weeks ago at 2 in the morning, for the low-level background hum of worry that most people have simply accepted as the standard condition of being alive. The default mode network is not malfunctioning when it does this. It is doing exactly what it evolved to do. The issue is that modern life gives it almost no reason to stop. And when that network runs unchecked, the downstream effects are not abstract. A large 2024 study published in Translational Psychiatry found that people with a lower natural tendency toward flow states were considerably more likely to receive diagnoses of depression, anxiety, and stress-related disorders over time. The neuroscience and the clinical picture are pointing in identical directions. The brain needs something to do that is genuinely demanding enough to pull it out of its own internal monologue, and demanding in a very specific way. Not stressful, not passive, but precisely calibrated. That calibration is exactly what crafting gets right, and almost entirely by accident. The condition for flow is not difficulty on its own. It is the match between challenge and skill, and that distinction matters more than it might first appear. Too easy, and the mind drifts back toward the default mode network. Too hard, and the brain's threat detection centers activate instead, flooding the system with cortisol rather than dopamine. The sweet spot, where a task sits just at the outer edge of what you can currently do, is where flow lives. Researchers van der Linden, Tops, and Bakker established in their April 2021 paper in Frontiers in Psychology that this sweet spot is governed by a specific neural system called the Locus Coeruleus norepinephrine system, which functions as the brain's own task engagement regulator, monitoring the gap between skill and challenge and adjusting arousal accordingly. It is, in practical terms, the biological mechanism that decides whether you are in the zone or not. Crafting engages this system repeatedly and almost automatically. A beginner knitter is fully stretched by a basic pattern, and an intermediate knitter moves to cables, and an advanced knitter designs their own construction from scratch, which means the challenge scales with the skill, and the skill grows through the practice. and the Locus Coeruleus norepinephrine system keeps pace with all of it. The brain is not being tricked. It is being given exactly what it is calibrated to respond to. Now for where this idea came from and why it took so long for anyone to take it seriously. Mihály Csíkszentmihályi was born in Hungary in 1934, and his childhood unfolded during the Second World War, during which he witnessed the collapse of ordinary adult society's capacity to function with any dignity or meaning under extreme pressure. That experience became the animating question of his entire career. Why do some people find meaning when everything falls apart, and others simply cannot? He eventually arrived in the United States, trained as a psychologist, and began asking people a deceptively simple question about when in their lives they felt most alive. The answers were consistent in ways he had not anticipated. Rock climbers described it, surgeons described it, chess players described it, along with factory workers performing repetitive assembly tasks and mothers during the focused parts of childcare. What they all reported was not happiness in the casual sense, but absorption, the disappearance of the gap between self and action, a state that felt like being carried rather than pushed. The first formal version of this theory arrived in 1975 in a book called Beyond Boredom and Anxiety, which is not a title designed to generate wide readership, and probably explains why most people today have never encountered it. The popular version, Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience, reached a much broader audience after its publication in 1990. But even then, the scientific tools to explain why flow felt the way it did were not yet in place. Csikszentmihalyi was documenting the phenomenon with precision and care, while the neuroscience needed to explain its mechanisms was still decades behind. The transient hypofrontality hypothesis, which proposes that reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex during flow produces the altered sense of time and self that subjects consistently described, was not formally put forward until 2004. The Locus Coeruleus norepinephrine framework arrived in 2021. The first peer-reviewed paper directly connecting flow to active inference and systems neuroscience appeared in January 2025 in Oxford Academics' Neuroscience of Consciousness, co-authored by Stephen Kotler and Carl Friston. Csikszentmihalyi died in October 2021 and never saw the field reach the level of mechanistic clarity that his original work had always deserved. If you find that particular gap between the quality of the original research and the pace of its scientific validation quietly infuriating, you are in reasonable company. When you sit down to a crafting task at the right difficulty level, 5 neurochemicals activate in sequence, and the order of that sequence is not incidental. Dopamine arrives first, driving focus and pattern recognition, which is why picking up a half-finished project feels rewarding even before any visible progress has been made. Norepinephrine follows, sharpening attention further. Endorphins layer in over time, which accounts for the mild physical ease that extended craft sessions tend to produce. Anandamide, the brain's endogenous cannabinoid, opens what researchers describe as lateral thinking, the capacity to draw connections across seemingly unrelated domains. And serotonin arrives after the session ends, which is why the hour following a focused crafting session tends to feel unusually settled and calm, not because you have rested, but because your brain has moved through the full neurochemical sequence. At the same time, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, downregulates its activity. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, drops. The default mode network quiets. The executive control network, which manages goal-directed and present-moment processing, takes over. The brain in this state is not passive. It is running in a high-performance mode that simply does not feel the way most people expect high performance to feel. A 2025 systematic review, the first of its kind to focus specifically on crafts-based interventions, examined 19 separate studies and all 19 found improvements in mood and life satisfaction following craft practice. 19 out of 19. In medical research, that kind of unanimity is not common, and the researchers were careful to note that the evidence base still needs larger and longer-term trials before clinical recommendations become standard, which is a fair scientific position. But 19 out of 19 is a signal, not a coincidence, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment. The scale of who this could affect is not trivial either. A UK household survey conducted between 2019 and 2020 found that approximately 20% of the British population engage in arts and crafts on a regular basis. A separate 2024 study from Anglia Ruskin University, drawing on data from 7,182 adults across England, found that crafting independently and positively predicted well-being and reduced loneliness above and beyond income, age, employment status, and all other standard demographic factors, not correlated with those outcomes. Predictive of them, which is a different and more telling relationship entirely. The neuroscience of flow connects naturally to something broader, which is neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to physically remodel its own architecture through repeated experience. That is its own complete story, and a longer one. If that kind of territory interests you, this channel tracks it as it develops. And the next piece in that direction is already in research, so why is none of what you have just heard common knowledge? Here is the 10% of the picture that reframes everything else. The same research that established flow as the peak state of human experience also surfaced something that Csikszentmihalyi found genuinely baffling and never fully resolved. People do not choose flow when given the option of something easier. When he surveyed the same individuals who described flow as the most satisfying state they had ever experienced, they consistently reported choosing passive leisure in their actual free time. Television, scrolling, the path of least resistance. The brain knows, at some level, that it needs the challenge, and then it votes against the challenge every single time it gets the opportunity. This is not a moral failure. It is a feature of how the brain processes anticipated effort. The cognitive cost of beginning a task registers before the neurochemical reward of flow becomes available, which means the brain runs its calculation at the wrong moment, before the dopamine system has a chance to correct it. The entry cost of picking up the needles feels larger than the payoff waiting on the other side, even though the payoff is real and the cost dissolves within minutes of starting. The single most actionable thing the neuroscience of flow suggests, and also the least glamorous piece of advice imaginable, is simply to begin. Not to want to begin. Not to create the optimal environment for beginning. Just to start the thing, so that the dopamine system can take over and fix the miscalculation the brain made in advance. A 2024 study tracked 353 students through 48 hours of lacquer painting practice spread across a semester, and at the end of the intervention, and again at a 2-month follow-up, mental health measures had improved across the group in ways that held over time. 48 hours over a semester is a modest investment for a measurable neurological outcome, and that is worth noting plainly. Now return to where this all started. You are almost certainly not a surgeon, but your brain is running the same hardware as one. The Locus Coeruleus norepinephrine system does not check your professional credentials before it regulates your task engagement. The amygdala does not ask whether you are being compensated before it stands down. The dopamine system does not require that the activity appear on your curriculum vitae before it fires. The neurochemistry is available to anyone who has access to a task that is just hard enough to require full attention and just achievable enough not to set off alarms. Csikszentmihalyi's subjects found the word flow themselves from the inside before he had given them any framework to work with, and what they described, independently and consistently, was being carried by the activity rather than forced through it, as though the work had its own momentum and they were simply moving with it rather than against anything. That is not a metaphor dressed up in scientific language. It is a description of a measurable neurological state, with documented brain chemistry, documented outcomes across clinical studies, and 19 consecutive research efforts pointing in the same direction without a single exception. Pick up the thing you keep meaning to pick up. Start it before you feel ready to, because the feeling of readiness is not coming first. The readiness comes after. And once the dopamine system takes over, the rest follows on its own.